So I don't need that many mics, thank you. My great pleasure to welcome my dear friend Alti Rodal, who is the director of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter Initiative. And as she will tell you soon, since we will be mentioning a commission of inquiry that took place in Canada in the 1980s, the Deschênes Commission. As a young woman, you were on the research staff of that commission. So you will provide some historical evidence about your own experience. So let me say a few words, and then we'll give you the floor. Thank you, Alti. So this obviously was not planned. It's not on the program because it exploded Sunday night, particularly Monday morning here in Canadian Parliament, Media and Society. So the Waffen-SS Galicia division as a case study of political memory in the middle of a war. A week ago, on Friday, September 22nd, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the Canadian Parliament. It's literally a week ago, it was Friday afternoon at this time, in an official visit. The reception was rapturous, and opposition parties were unanimous in their support, in stark contrast with the deadlock in the American Congress, which Zelensky had not been allowed to speak the day before in Washington, D.C. At the outset, the Canadian Speaker of the House, Mr. Anthony Rota, acknowledged a 98-year-old man in attendance named Yaroslav Humka and presented him as a Ukrainian hero and a Canadian hero who had fought Russians. He got a standing ovation. Hardly anyone noticed in real time that what the man actually did in World War II was highly problematic. Well, I happened to have been in real time in a TV studio, CBC French, Radio-Canada, with the hosts, with a huge screen in front of us of what's happening, the events in Parliament. And somehow I completely missed it myself. And it seems 99%, if not everybody, missed it. Mr. Humka had served in the Waffen-SS Galicia division, a military unit created in 1943 and which was active in Galicia in the last few months of the war in 1944. Once the information was picked up by Canadian and international media, a few days later, the political fallout was enormous here in Canada, and the speaker eventually had to resign, which I believe never happened in the history of the Canadian Parliament, that a speaker, not a cabinet member, had to resign. The Canadian government was embarrassed and issued a formal apology to Zelensky, the Jewish community, and Nazi victims. Ukrainian combatants in German uniforms or in tactical alliance with German forces, so what they did is a dark page in Ukrainian history, and has been the subject of considerable research in the past 2 decades. The broader theme of political memory has been featured in this seminar almost continuously between 2008, when it became politically salient in Ukraine under President Yushchenko, and the pandemic, when the seminar, alas, was suspended for 2 years. But it is one thing to have it discussed in academic gatherings, such as this forum, and quite another to suddenly become leading news items overnight in major media. This was the first time, in fact, in 40 years that the Galicia division was publicly discussed here in Canada, when, as I just indicated, the Deschênes Commission, we're talking the mid-80s, investigated the alleged presence of war criminals in Canada. It was then revealed that about 2,000 former members of the Galicia division had immigrated to Canada in the early 1950s. Now, the Galicia division case raises several key questions in how the state and civil society shape political memory. First, why did Mr. Junca and others join the SS unit? Second, what exactly did they do? Third, how have they been framed in Ukrainian and Soviet/Russian political memory? And finally, how have they been framed in Canadian debates this week, and what impact, if any, could this have on Canadian or Western support of Ukraine in the ongoing full-scale invasion? So first, young Ukrainians joined the division because they feared most the return of Soviet power in Galicia. After the nearly 2 years of terror unleashed by the Soviet annexation of Galicia, 1939 to mid-1941, or at least this is how the Ukrainian national movement presented it, that we fear Soviet reincorporation of the area. They also feared, talking about the young men, being sent to Germany as forced labor. The question implicit in media reporting this week is whether they believed in Nazi ideology, that they were Nazis. We can't really answer that, other than point out that they were exposed to SS political indoctrination in their training. They were trained by SS officers, who by definition were fanatics. That's what was being in the SS, not the Waffen-SS, but the SS was all about. And they, I'm talking about the young men, originated from a social milieu close to the far-right organization of Ukrainian nationalists, the OUN, the only organization which actually had survived the Soviet occupation of Galicia. For the general public here in Canada, the assumption is that a Nazi soldier believes in Nazi ideals, making the honoring of a Waffen-SS veteran absolutely toxic. Second, did they commit war crimes? The historical record, and here Alti probably have more to say about that, shows, there's actually a new book by Professor Miroslav Shkandry on the Galicia division. For those of you interested in the small world of Canadian politics, the Vice Prime Minister, the second most powerful member of the Trudeau cabinet, Chrystia Freeland, has one uncle in Alberta who's the top expert on the OUN and the Holocaust, and another uncle out in Manitoba who's the expert on the Galicia division. But real books, real scholarship, end of the small world. So what is the historical record? It shows that they most likely, at least in terms of the initial composition of the Galicia division, the one that fought and was almost entirely destroyed at the Battle of Brody, the last battle of occupied Soviet Union before German forces retreated in Min-44, they most likely did not commit war crimes. I'm talking about specifically the division that became operational in 1944. The Holocaust in Galicia was over by the time the division was operational in early 44. A massacre of Poles in a Galician village, we're not talking about Volyn here, but Galicia in early 44. There was a massacre that involved Ukrainian regiments that it turns out were not yet incorporated into the division. So, borderline. From a legal perspective, established at the Nuremberg trial in an all war crimes tribunals ever since, an affiliation to a criminal organization, which was ruled by the Nuremberg trial that the SS or a criminal organization, but an affiliation to a criminal organization, such as the SS, does not legally make one a war criminal. An actual crime must be established. After 1941, other Ukrainian formations, such as OUN-affiliated militias, were implicated in atrocities, including in 1941 pogroms. But the evidence with the Galicia division is thin. But in Jewish or Polish historical memory, however, the distinction between various Ukrainian units is blurred, understandably. The Galicia division symbolizes the crimes perpetrated by the SS throughout the war. On the whole, Canadian legacy media reporting has actually been balanced on this point. And I was personally given the opportunity as chair of Ukrainian studies to appear several times on the main evening news channels in each language, on the CBC English, the national, and the multiple French ones, Téléjournal, 24/60, in the first 3 days of the political storm, and they were all asking me to provide the historical context, and I was basically trying in 5-6 minutes to say what I have maybe in 12 here. Third, the Ukrainian framing of the division occurred mostly in the diaspora. In Ukraine, the focus tends to be on the massive OUN insurgency, which lasted through the late 1940s. This, to me, is the inspiration of the current resistance against Russian aggression. The Galicia division is, in fact, little known in Ukraine. Well, I'm told it's in the textbooks and so forth, but certainly it's not a major topic in debates compared to the OUN, who gets probably 50 times more coverage. In the Canadian diaspora, the older generation sees it as a Ukrainian national army that fought the Russians. I should add here, things are always a bit complicated, even though a great many Eastern Ukrainians actually served in the Red Army, but they were Soviet power, Moscow power. The blind spot is the toxicity of Nazi symbols. Posting a band of brothers-like picture of himself and his friend resting in a German training camp in 1943, as Mr. Hunka did on the blog a decade ago. At the time when SS troops were sending Galician Jews to the Belzec extermination camps, is emblematic of the chilling indifference prevailing in certain circles at the time. This is not unique to Ukrainians by any means. Waffen-SS units were formed in almost every state of East, Central, and Western Europe, including in France. But we are talking here about the Galicia division. The Soviet Russian framing was cynical towards Jews. Until the very end of the Soviet Union, Soviet memory silenced the basic reality that Jews had been targeted as Jews, that there had been a Holocaust on Soviet soil, on monuments such as in Babin Yar, and coincidentally, this is the day of the great commemoration of the Babian massacre, September 29, 1941, today. So on monuments in Babi Yar, Jewish victims appeared as unnamed Soviet citizens, and that was basically throughout the land. From the start, the purpose has been, in the Soviet-Russian narrative, to criminalize the very idea of Ukrainian nationalism, and therefore the very idea of a Ukrainian state distinct from Russia. This is the link with the 2022 Russians' full-scale invasion of Ukraine and its claim to, quote, unquote, denazification. The purpose is to force upon the notion once and for all that Ukrainians are regional variations of Russians deferring to Moscow dominance. The sinister application of this principle is to associate Ukrainian nationalists, which I simply define here as those supporting a Ukrainian state distinct from Russia, in other words, the overwhelming majority of the population, with mass violence. So to associate nationalism with mass violence. This is how Putin framed the annexation of Crimea and the 22 invasion as a prevention against genocide. Somehow, The acts of the Galicia division and some OUN units 80 years ago are meant to explain why Russia had to invade Ukraine. This was the gist of an unreadable communique issued by the Russian embassy in Canada on Monday. But to the Canadian political class, and most likely in public opinion, we'll see, the Russian claim remains as ludicrous, if not delirious, as it had been before the Hunka scandal. To most Canadians, the revelation that some Ukrainians in World War II served in SS military uniform was shocking. But the degree of improvisation that led to the public honoring of a Waffen-SS veteran, the story here is that the speaker had not even consulted with the national Canadian Ukrainian organizations, was also shocking. Turns out that Mr. Hunka was someone who lived in his riding up in Northern Ontario, and the local association put him forward. So it was like completely bypassing national authorities who were most likely would have known better. The consensual narrative is that here in Canada, that it was hurtful to the Jewish community and embarrassing to Zelensky, but it's a Canadian problem. Thank you. And now I turn to my dear friend Alti.
Well, I can say that I more or less agree with everything you've just said.
Your mic?
It's not on.
All right, use mine. Yeah.
So I was just saying that I more or less agree with what Dominique has just said. I'm happy to see him. I'm happy to see May Fowler and a few other friends.
Speak closer to the mic, maybe.
But dismayed about the topic that's bringing me here. And it was a shock. Usually when something bad happens, one looks to how do I see it as an opportunity and what can I do with this? Well, it was an accident waiting to happen. And part of the problem was that somebody who was part of the Ukrainian community could think that it would be a good thing to honor a person who served under German command during the war and who bore an insignia that indicated that he had sworn an oath to Hitler. So that is certainly problematic, but I'm dismayed also at the media's coverage. What I've been reading, conflation of SS and Waffen-SS, little knowledge about who these people were, calling them people who committed atrocities during the Holocaust, in the Jewish organizations as well. And to the credit of the Jewish organizations, they still concluded their remarks, almost every single one of them, with, "But we stand in support of Ukraine today." Ukraine today is not Ukraine of 1941 or 43. Coming from that perspective now, I'm going back to 40 years ago. I can't believe it, but it's 40 years ago that I was the chief historian with the Shen Commission, and I was given the task of telling the story of how people with Nazi background might have entered Canada. In other words, the story of immigration and security screening, and also to tell the story of Canadian government policies once allegations were brought before them. So I had a wealth of documentation that was made available to me through the assistance of the Commission, and it was a fascinating time for me as a historian to be working on the topic. And since I was told to speak in 5 minutes...
You speak,
yeah.
you speak. You speak, there's
what
no
I
limit
decided
here.
to do is to focus on 3 main findings of the report that I did for the Commission. One chapter in the report dealt with the Waffen-SS division. There were also chapters on the French Nazi collaborators, on the German scientists and technicians who ended up in Canada, Romanian, Hungarian, various national groups who had collaborated in one way or another with the Nazi operations of genocide against Jews and other victims. So what I want to do is give you just a very brief summary of the three main findings. And then my report was an independent product from that of Justice Deschênes, who produced his report. And he had invited me to deal with these issues. He had two other teams, a team that dealt with the investigations. Are the people who are said to be criminals, are they in Canada? And that was dealt with by retired RCMP officers and others. And then there was a team of lawyers dealing with, are there legal avenues after all these years to deal with is there any scope for taking action on such matters in Canada so many years later. And then there was my task, which was the history. And we had only 6 months in which to do it. And when I saw the bulk of information that I would have to go through, I didn't think I could do it. But unfortunately, the commission had an extension of another year, and I had the permission to hire 3 researchers, excellent researchers, and the result was this 600-page report, which Deschênes thought initially that he would just integrate it into his, but it was just too bulky. So he wrote in the postscript of his own public report that this report exists, that it's an outstanding contribution and so on, and that it should be widely distributed. Some of you may know that it was not widely distributed. It was in fact held back by the government and censored in parts. Their sections I waited out, and that's what gave it even more of a cachet with the media and with people. Anyways, that's a separate story. But back to the 3 points, and then what Deschênes came up with as his response to these 3 issues, and then my reflections and an update on research. As you said, it's in the last 2 decades that there was a lot of research on this topic. So it's an ambitious goal that I put to myself, but I'll try to do it. I did put notes so that I don't stray from just telling you what I want to say. So my first finding, based on historical accounts available in the 1980s, I found that there was no compelling evidence that the division as a unit committed atrocities against civilians. There were allegations, but there was no evidence. And in his public report, Justice Deschênes concurred with this finding. As Dominique said, since the 2010s, Polish and other scholars have asserted that the division had engaged in several anti-partisan actions and raising of a village in Poland in which Polish civilians and also Jews in hiding were killed. In May, I was on a panel to discuss Miroslav Shkandry's book, which I read carefully and was very impressed by the depth of detail and the research, memoirs, and he's been thinking about this topic for many, many years, and it's a valuable contribution to our understanding of the division. So in his book, he attributes the crimes to Galician volunteer regiments, at times conflated with the division. The fact that towards the end of the war, these regiments were incorporated into the division raises questions for me. Were members of these regiments among the nearly 9,000 people who surrendered to the Allies in Italy in 1945? Were they among the few thousand who came to Canada? So these are questions that remain. My second finding is that there was a measure of continuity between the Ukrainian auxiliary police forces and other military formations, including such regiments as Shkandry referred to, that operated in 1941-1942 in the environment of collaboration with the Einsatzgruppen on Ukrainian territory, and the division that was established in 1943 and didn't start operating until 1944. So in particular, the reconstitution of the division after the Battle of Brody, when only 3,000 men remained of 11,000, and when 12,000 additional men were added to the formation, offered an occasion for such persons with criminal background to be integrated into the division. So, for reasons not made explicit, Justice Deschênes did not highlight this finding in his report. However, one could say that it was implied in his not precluding the possibility of prosecuting crimes committed by individual members of the division. Shkandri, in his book, speaks of, he accepts this finding. In other words, he speaks about individuals. Certainly that is a possibility. There are all kinds of individuals, stragglers. When the police units were disbanded, where did they go? They either went to the UPA or they tried to join and get military training. And that was another important motivation, to get military training, not to be as weak and helpless as they saw the Jews being in the face of the Nazis. And they were not so sure at all, as you know, about what the Nazis had in store for them. So Shkandri does a marvelous job in offering a detailed picture of the diversity among the recruits to the division, ranging from innocent teenagers, and Hunka might have been one of them, he was 18 years old, to hardened fighters who had already accumulated a long enough and murky history, and that's quoting Shkandri. And this is what I found as well. And I based my finding then not only on secondary sources, but on an examination of case studies that were before the commission. I had access to the files, and I looked at them for the purpose of illustrating policies, government policies. And that was an important finding at the time. But my third finding concerns the absence of adequate screening. And this goes throughout the period. Individual members of the division were not screened, contrary to what Justice Deschênes said in his report, contrary to what has been picked up in the Wikipedia articles. They were not screened. And Ukrainian scholars agree with me, agree on this point. The archival documents that I examined in the 80s already pointed to minimal, very sketchy screening after the division surrendered to the Allies. And Olesya Hromechuk's study corroborates this, pointing out that of the nearly 9,000 men in Rimini, 2.5% were screened individually.
You're referring to a British camp where the divisia ended up in Italy
yes.
After the war.
Yeah. And the main screening official there, Haldane Porter, said as much. These men may be lying. They come to me in large numbers without documentation. We hear them through interpreters. We're also coaching them on what to say. They were at the same time trying to escape the Soviet service, the drive to repatriate anybody who had lived in Soviet territory before the war. So this was a major reason why people would lie and what caused them to do whatever they could and for other Ukrainians to try to help them escape from the clutches of the Soviets at the time. Shkandri adds, actually, in his book, that British officials had intended to conduct a more thorough screening of the members of the division once they arrived in Britain, but this did not happen. An undetermined number of former members of the division entered Canada with government approval, legally, in 1951. But it's a long story. The lobbying to bring them to Canada started in 47, 48, And there was steadfast refusal by government officials to accept them, and that for a number of reasons. There was persistent lobbying and very widespread lobbying, mainly from the Ukrainian community, but even the same Haldane Porter, who screened them, thought they were good guys, caught up in whatever happened during the war, but they would make good citizens in Canada. The British wanted them out, but Canada was a place where they could be sent. So this is part of that story. Why did the government refuse to let them in more readily, when in fact they were quite open, much more open to Baltic Waffen-SS members from 1948 on? And that story is more camouflage, but it was done on a case-by-case basis, whether they had family here in Canada or they were convinced by the argument that they were forcibly conscripted. And the Ukrainians also tried that argument, but it was not believable, because 100,000 or so volunteered, and 11,000, I mean, the story just fell apart. But with the Baltic people, there was greater readiness, and I read many reports by Canadian officials who went to the DP camps and more or less presented a hierarchy of which people to accept and which people were lower down. Jews were a little bit lower down, but the Balts were right at the top. And also, they wanted admission as a group, a large group, and that was problematic. And the government was concerned that this might be controversial. And it was controversial. However, there were a few developments that facilitated their entry. And that was that the Volksdeutsch, members of the Nazi Party, and Baltic Waffen-SS people were more openly being admitted by 1950. So why discriminate against Ukrainians? There was no screening by the Deschênes Commission either, retrospective screening of that could even be done at that time. But they had a list. I mean, one of the things to know about the Deschênes Commission, that they would not seek out names of war criminals. They only looked at allegations that were brought to them or brought to the government in previous years, to the RCMP, where they landed usually with the RCMP. So only those cases were looked at. And there was a list from the Simon Wiesenthal Center of, I believe, 217 men. And the Deschênes Commission did send some of its staff to the Berlin Documentation Center to check out these names. And then, of course, if they did not come to Canada, no interest in them at all. If there was a whole series of criteria. Of course, if they're dead, we're not interested in them anymore. So it really boiled down to nothing. And nonetheless, the cases that I looked at did have this continuity with the earlier police units. So this is about all that I will say formally, and I'm prepared to answer any questions.
Daria? Yeah.
Questions from the audience. Thanks for your presentation. I have a question. Did Deschênes Commission ask Soviets about some documents regarding to the division? Because what I know from KGB records, so the KGB tried to find any evidence to prove the involvement of division to war crimes. So question, if the Deschênes Commission asked Soviets and if Soviets sent something, if it in their maybe task and other things.
So I was not privy to everything that the Commission did. I know that there were a number of books published by the Soviets. I forget their names, Werewolves or Henchmen, whatever, referring to the division, and very severe allegations. They were not taken seriously, as far as I can tell, from the report of Justice Deschênes. He was a very balanced and reasonable person and understood where they were coming from. That much of this was inspired by anti-national, anti-Ukrainian nationalism. But where there's a grain of truth, that's where they build up their propaganda. And unfortunately, the happening in Parliament this past week provides that kind of grain of truth. Because all you see in the papers is Ukrainian Nazi, Nazi Ukrainian, and it's not deserved, certainly not deserved for Ukraine today, and just misses out on the complexity of the situation in the 1940s and the great diversity. And one thing one should mention is that 7 times as many Ukrainians served in the Soviet army as did Ukrainians who collaborated. And 1.5 million Soviet citizens collaborated with the Germans. So if they want to bring that story up, we can throw back to them. What about other Soviet citizens, all the Russians who collaborated with the Germans?
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question, maybe a comment more like, do you think this situation also possible because crimes of communism were not condemned as were condemned crimes of Nazism? Because we can speak about Holocaust as a genocide of Jewish people, but like now we speak about Holodomor as genocide of Ukrainian people, but Ukrainians were not the only one from Soviet Union who were like massively genocided. Thank you.
Would you like to take that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay. I believe the question is, did the fact that Soviet crimes were not punished contribute to the possibility of the situation developing now?
I think it's a problem in Russia, clearly. Of course, there is zero introspection certainly right now at the state level. There's a complete criminalization of research and debates about what the Soviet regime did all throughout the Soviet Union, starting with the Gulag. So they shut down Memorial and all civil society organizations on the grounds that they are foreign agents. So the idea of even human rights is considered pernicious. That is certainly the case. Yes.
So I would just add that in Soviet times, right after the war, there was a flurry of trials of war criminals. And it included Ukrainians and Russians and others. It then stopped, and then it started again in the 60s and again in the 80s. We wrote about it in our report. And each of these times it was done in a very heavy-handed way and very obviously targeting also nationalists. And there was, in contrast with the Holocaust, which was followed by the Nuremberg trials, the Soviet crimes were suppressed for all those decades within the Soviet Union, and it's only in the last few decades that that one is talking about the Holodomor, and this is certainly an issue, but it's the way history evolved.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. So I was wondering actually, like here we're all, smart, educated people, but how do you teach this case? Like, how do, for example, middle schools, high schools in Canada should comprehend that, especially that, from what I know, Canadian curriculum is not so much focused on East and Central Europe in general. So, like, how do you approach such a case in the Canadian context?
I would say transparently, with facing the past, coming to terms with what happened, and it's something that is happening now on a variety of fronts, with Aboriginal people and Black, I prefer to call them Afro people. This is an opportunity, as I said. It's an opportunity to just come to terms with the past, and those aspects of the past that are not so pretty, condemn them. And we do want to build a society, and there's going to be a major opportunity for Ukraine to be rebuilding in a variety of ways. And the 2,000 or so mass graves that are still largely unmarked and unprotected is one way of building the society, especially when it's in the same places that we have mass graves again today. So where there's goodwill and vision, I'm not answering the question precisely for education, but I think that children can be brought along at whatever their level of age and understanding is, to appreciate that there were times when people acted according to what they thought was right then, or according to how they perceived the world then. Some things were right, some things were wrong. I mean, all this can be explained.
I think the confronting and engaging the past is part and parcel of what democracy is understood to be nowadays. So it is true in Canada, it is true in France, it is true in Ukraine, very difficult during an existential war, but there was actually a space in Ukraine before 2022 to discuss these issues. The same issues that we discuss here at the Danyliw seminar. We went to conferences in Kiev, and they were talked about. Right now in Russia and other authoritarian states, and these, including Poland increasingly, being led by a far-right regime, the space then narrows considerably, and you start criminalizing, questioning the past. But if you don't question the past, then the contemporary meaning of citizenships loses its value.
Just a point on the Nuremberg trials. I don't believe they actually found any of the Nazis guilty of genocide, because the Soviets objected to the whole idea of genocide being included, simply because we feared to some extent that their own people would be caught up in the whole of modern other actions. And I know growing up in the 50s and 60s, people knew about the Holocaust, but it wasn't in the front of the public eye until the mid to late 60s and then the early 70s, when the children and some of the survivors themselves began talking about it more and more. So, in some ways, the other genocides affected the proper persecution of the Nazis in terms of the Holocaust.
Want me to address that? Yeah, I think you're conflating the Nuremberg trial of 45 and the UN Convention on the Prevention of Genocide in 48. At Nuremberg, the term genocide had not really caught up yet, even though Lemkin was promoting it. The charge was crimes against humanity. That was the first legal. They invented basically the concept of crimes against humanity. So Nazis were charged with crimes against peace, which we call now war of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. That included the Holocaust, which was not yet called the Holocaust, but atrocities against Jews. But then in 48, when the convention, it's not a treaty, or what is it called, the resolution or the declaration, I'm blanking on the term, but basically, it's a convention, thank you. What the Soviets objected to is to use the word social as one of the criteria targeting individuals. You know, they can be targeting on ethnic, racial. They may have skipped the racial and just used ethnic, religious, and but not social, precisely because they had dekulakization and so forth, the deportations of, well, essentially what they did to the peasants in the 30s. So kind of a separate story.
I'm afraid we have to finish discussion now and move to our next presenter.
Thank you. Thank you, Alti. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. Ouais,